there is this frustration that had been boiling up over this impunity against corruption, against, let's say, these economic issues, underlying economic issues, finally boiled over that led to the death of, I believe, on the first day it was about 19. And which is the single largest loss of life in a protest in a single day in Nepal. And I think that just tipped the scales. What began as a largely peaceful demonstration soon spiraled into targeted attacks on the private residences of political leaders, on state institutions. Young people have been discussing the vastly different lives that the children of politicians, the political class, and those of the business establishment have been living. What irked the Nepali public more was not just the impunity, in that none of these corruption scams were being addressed. And I think we can call it a revolution now, because essentially the Nepali politics has pretty much turned on its head since Tuesday. One of the things about KP Oli is that he always resorts to hyper-nationalism whenever he's backed up in a corner.
Hello and welcome back to the Hindustan Times podcast. I'm Shashank Mattoo, your host. We are sitting here today talking about Nepal, what's been happening in Nepalese politics over the last couple of days. We saw the dramatic rise of the GenZ protests, as they're being called, the fall of the KP Sharma Oli government, and now negotiations taking place to decide the future of Nepal, the rise of a new interim government that can take charge of the country and perhaps deliver some of the reforms that people have so badly wanted in Nepal. Joining me to break down what exactly has happened is someone who's on the ground in Kathmandu, really one of the best analysts of Nepal, its foreign relations, and that is Amish Raj Mulmi, an author who's, of course, has written the book, All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China. Amish, thank you so much for joining us. Why don't I just ask you to start us off to an Indian audience that may not be as familiar with what's happening in Nepal and the state of Nepalese politics. How exactly did we get here? What exactly was so dramatic over the last week that we saw in Nepal, and where exactly is the country right now?
Thank you, Shashank. So the underlying causes of the movement have been very, very, let's say, like, evident for a while now. I think the underlying causes regarding corruption, impunity towards corruption, the mass unemployment, lack of economic opportunities at home. I think all of these have been very evident in multiple protests over the past few years. And particularly, we witnessed that in April as well, when protests by pro-monarchy forces got extremely violent. And where we got to this particular point in history, what happened was, now there's a sequence of events over here. Now, while these underlying causes remain, there has been a movement on, let's say, the internet, the Nepali internet, where young people have been discussing the vastly different lives that the children of politicians, the political class, and those of the business establishment have been living, which is a far cry from the ordinary Nepali lives, right? And this campaign called Nepo Baby campaign, Nepo Kid campaign, it had been going on for a while on Nepali social media. And the Nepal government, the Oli government particularly, decided to ban social media during this period under its new social media bill. It asked social media companies to register with the Ministry of Information and Communication Technology within a week. And there was too short a time frame for social media companies to do so. And when the ban was implemented, the Nepali internet obviously rose up in flames. Now, we have to remember that Nepal has one of the youngest populations in the world. I believe it has a median age closer to about 25, 26. And there is this frustration that had been boiling up over this impunity against corruption, against, let's say, these economic issues, underlying economic issues, finally boiled over on Monday, where a largely peaceful protest was fired upon by state officials, by security officials. The security forces showed excess use of force in using, let's say, live bullets at firing at unarmed protesters. That led to the death of, I believe, on the first day it was about 19, and which is the single largest loss of life in a protest in a single day in Nepal. And I think that just tipped the scales in that there was massive anger. There's very much the virulent rage at not just the insensitivity of the government towards the protesters, towards the issues the protesters had raised, which is that remove the social media ban, yes, but also tackle the issues around corruption. But the brutality with which state forces came down on the protesters, they were firing quite indiscriminately. There were a massive loss of, let's say, like I mean, this the scale of the loss of lives, especially that of young children, I think really shook the Nepali conscience. And on Tuesday, this tipped over into particular rage towards the political class, where what began as a largely peaceful demonstration soon spiraled into targeted attacks on the private residences of political leaders, on state institutions, on institutions of on media institutions, and as well as business establishments perceived as being close to the political establishment. So you could see that there was this massive rage, the frustration, the everything that I had been, let's say, what I identified as the underlying causes, finally erupted into this inferno, right? Where almost every institution of the state has been attacked. And this is not just in Kathmandu, across Nepal, in fact, almost every, all urban municipalities, I think, have been burned down. I think district administration offices everywhere have been attacked. Ward offices have been attacked everywhere. Businesses, hotels have been attacked everywhere. So it is not just a Kathmandu phenomenon. It is a pan-Nepal phenomenon that just erupted on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, it was clear that there was a Prime Minister Oli. He finally resigned, and he finally resigned around 2 p.m. If I remember correctly. The army finally moved in around 10 p.m. The troops moved in around 10 p.m. to secure the city, to secure the country, and by then the damage had been done. So thereafter, of course, the situation is that the army is taking charge of security. There are curfews, and there are, let's say, like I mean, prohibitory orders during which, of course, like I mean, there are sort of break periods for daily chores, things like that. But that, and like you correctly identified, negotiations are on between the president, between the old parties, representatives of the old party, between the Gen Z organizers, and currently also between Sushila Karki, a former Chief Justice who's been identified as the person to lead this next interim government, as well as the army is also playing a role in these negotiations. So that's where we are at right now.
Right. Amish, thank you so much for that. So let me just start breaking this down piece by piece, because I started seeing these videos on Instagram as well. In fact, if any of our viewers want to go, you can still probably find them of these, like you were saying, Gen Z protesters putting out videos of the children of Nepalese elites living, in foreign countries, going on Europe vacations. I remember there was one of the leader of a very senior politician, posting Chanel and Louis Vuitton bags, which cost thousands of dollars, while the ordinary Nepalese youth finds it difficult to get a job, probably has to migrate out of the country as well. Could you explain to people who are perhaps not as familiar with Nepal's politics, the economics, the fact that so many people have had to leave the country to find opportunities, and also some of the roots of the anger against the elite there, in terms of the corruption, in terms of exactly this, the Nepo baby protests?
Okay, let me just count this backward, right? I'll start from the corruption. Now, over the past few years alone, right? I'll just name some of the corruption, let's say, scandals that have erupted. Nepalese ministers have been implicated in a fake refugee scam in which they were sending Nepalese as fake Bhutanese refugees abroad. Nepalese bureaucrats have been implicated in a scam in which they were taking bribes to send Nepalese abroad without proper documentation on tourist visas, but actually they were leaving for work. The infrastructure projects have seen massive graft, and this including airports. So this has been reported by parliamentary committees. There is graft on an everyday scale, and it has been endemic. Nepal's rankings and the Transparency International corruption rankings have been slipping as well. So that is the corruption bit, right? But what irked the Nepali public more was not just the impunity, in that none of these corruption scams were being addressed. No leaders were being punished, in that they were being sent to jail. But what apart from that? And okay, I forgot to add that simultaneously, what we are also seeing is massive cooperative finance scheme failures. So running into billions of rupees, right? So ordinary Nepalis, their savings were being wiped out because a lot of these cooperatives are owned by, let's say, individuals close to political parties. You're not seeing any economic reforms which is required to generate employment, which is required to bring in foreign direct investment into the country. So because you're not seeing any employment opportunities or economic opportunities in here, a lot of Nepalis have been migrating abroad. In fact, if I remember correctly, the World Bank noted that about 25 to 30% of the Nepali GDP is composed of remittances from abroad. And you can see this is this young, population, nearly before the protests, I believe the figure was about 1,700 Nepalis going abroad every day to work. And that is a massive figure for a country that is essentially young. Like I said previously, that this is a majority, more than 50% of the population is below the age of 30, right? And you have this situation where there is an aspirational population, there's a population that has seen the world because they've gone abroad to work. This is a population that has, let's say, knows with other issues around the world. They've seen Bangladesh, they've seen Sri Lanka, they've seen Indonesia recently. They know that uh, such an issue is the difference, the distinction, or rather the disparity between the political class, the political establishment, and them, the common person, right, is vast. And I think, like I said, it just boiled over. It was a scale that was slowly being tipped over, and the social media ban was this, the final pushing point.
Understood. Amish, could I ask you a question about where politics is right now? You were mentioning, of course, that there are negotiations now going on. The Gen Z protesters are speaking to the army. A interim government is likely to take hold. What exactly is this going to look like? What reforms are going to have to take place, and what are the political parties going to be doing? Of course, KP Sharma Oli is out of power, but people like him, as well as the other leaders of the established Nepalese political parties, are going to be waiting in the wings. We've already seen in a country like Bangladesh that reform is very, very hard to actually do. What exactly is the interim government going to focus on? What are its priorities, and how successful can it be?
Because this is, as we speak, negotiations are still ongoing, right? So I particularly identify the way in which it will move ahead. But I think one of the things that has been clear is this has been common to Gen Z protesters, the petitions that they've sent, is that they would like the current parliament to be dissolved, and the interim government that would be formed, it would go into a fresh elections. So they are seeking a fresh mandate. So that's what we know as of now, and the fact that they've chosen by popular vote on Discord that Sushila Karki would be their leader, the leader of this interim government. So that is what we know as of now.
Okay, perfect, fine. Amish, let me just ask you also a little bit about some of the visuals that we were seeing sitting here, and of course that the Indian public was also seeing about, the parliament on fire and so on and so forth. Now, Gen Z protesters have distanced themselves from the violence and have said that, look, theirs was a peaceful protest. What exactly triggered this sort of violence? Who exactly was behind uh, this sort of violence? Of course, there's been that conversation about other groups of forces in Nepalese politics also joining on these protests and really, torching, let's say, media officers as well as other political institutions. What exactly caused all of that? Because that was the defining image of the protests that went out not only to India but to the international media as well.
No, like the Gen Z have said, right? Theirs was essentially a peaceful demonstration on Tuesday, and but as with all, let's say, leaderless movements or popular protest movements across the world, groups with their own particular agendas always, interject, interfere, and infiltrate these sort of popular movements, right? So we exactly don't know who are the instigators behind such the violence or the arson on such mass scale. So we cannot currently identify who these, let's say, elements were who engaged in such mass scale destruction of government property, of state institutions. But the police has certainly started carrying out investigations into this. And the hope is that they are quickly brought to book, because the destruction of these state institutions has meant that the Nepal government has been paralyzed in a lot of, let's say, sectors. For instance, this morning I was walking past a few government institutions, and I saw the Ministry of Health has been completely gutted. And that poses a serious challenge for a country where malnutrition remains a big issue, where infant vaccination still continues to be dictated by, let's say, access to Ministry of Health officials, like who is the centralized authority in this. So these issues will definitely come up in the days to come.
So, Amish, another point of contention is basically the tension right now that exists between the Nepalese political parties, the Gen Z politicians, as well as the pro-royalist parties that are sort of seem to advocate for a return of the monarchy in Nepal. What is the balance of power right now between these different political forces in Nepal?
Now, see, I want to be clear over here that the pro monarchy forces have definitely hijacked this movement. This movement was never about the return of the monarchy, and the pro monarchy forces have inserted their own political agenda, like I referred to before, in what was essentially a peaceful demonstration. Right now, in terms of the political actors after, and I think we can call it a revolution now, because essentially the Nepali politics has pretty much turned on its head since Tuesday. The old political parties, primarily the three major political parties, the Congress, the UML, as well as the Maoists, I think they have lost all public credibility. I don't think there is any credibility over there among the youth specifically. Of its top leaders are currently with the army in their barracks. So there is very little contact between the top leaders and the cadres on the ground. So reorganization is taking a lot longer but um, they are slowly trying to emphasize and assert the position that they remain a political, let's say, stakeholder in this whole entire issue. However, the issue remains that these geriatric readers continue to be in positions of power. And I don't think these old political parties will regain any confidence from the public as long as the old leadership continues to take charge. And this is where the younger leadership, and of course, in all parties, there is a younger leadership. There is a younger leadership that had been vying for and struggling to get into leadership positions, but now this is broken out. This will break out into open. That I'm quite certain of. So that they are one of the actors over here. The other actors are, of course, the president as the constitutional head of state and the supreme commander in chief of the armed forces. I think he's the last remaining constitutional authority, and he essentially represents the constitution, the 2015 constitution right now of a democratic Nepal. So he is an extremely important actor in this. And the other, there are two. I would call it one side is represented by Sushila Karki, right? Sushila Karki is, of course, agreed to become the interim head, but so, like I said, the negotiations are currently ongoing, and associated with her other Gen Z organizers, which is led by this group called Hami Nepal, and Sudan Gurung in particular has emerged as the leader of Hami Nepal. He was the leader of Hami Nepal, but he's emerged as the voice of this protest movement among the Gen Zs. So these are the four political, let's say, like satellites around which this current, let's say, like Nepali political planet is revolving around.
Right. Amish, let me ask you a little bit about the foreign policy of all of this as well, right? Which is that, KP Sharma Oli's government fell. He releases a statement which sort of obliquely refers to India. He sort of says that, he suffered a great deal because he pressed Nepal's territorial claims to Lipulek and Kalapani. He also said that, he insisted that Sri Ram was born in Nepal and not India. And, he suffered because of that as well. Was this some sort of reference to India and India's role in his ouster? Could you unpack that for us a little bit? Because that got a lot of comment here in India.
I mean, he is obliquely referring to India here, but one of the things about KP Oli is that he always resorts to hyper-nationalism whenever he's backed up in a corner. I think that's been to his go-to trick, and I don't think it will work anymore because, like I said, his very public credibility is gone, especially after Monday, especially with even, like I said, the brutality with which his government cracked down on peaceful protesters, particularly young peaceful protesters. I think that was incredible, and I think this statement by him was just another way of let's say, resorting to his old tactics of bringing back nationalism, Nepali nationalism, when he's just backed up. And I don't think the Gen Z in particular have been taken in or been convinced by this argument at all.
Right. Amish, should I ask you a little bit about India's response to the conflict, to what's happened in Nepal, to the violence and so on? When the protests began and we saw the news coming in of the Gen Z protesters being killed, the Indian Prime Minister put out a statement condoling the deaths. Now, of course, it's also issued a travel advisory for its citizens. India has, at various points in time, been accused of having some of the other role in Nepal's politics, sometimes positive, sometimes not so positive. At least that's the perception. What exactly should India's approach be to what's happening in Nepal? Can it help out in terms of moving the political consensus forward? Should it stay out, adopt a wait and see approach? What exactly do you think India is up to here?
No, I mean, historically, India has always stood with a democratic Nepal. I think that should continue. My sense is that India needs to, like I said, the Nepali political, let's say, universe has completely changed. Like there's a brand new political alignment, let's say, world that has happened in Nepal now. And I think India must get used to what is a young population putting forth demands about reforms, about constitutional, let's say, like changes. I think India must listen to these voices. India must continue the engagements that it was doing with the people in Nepal in other spheres, such as connectivity, such as, let's say, like economic, let's say, like engagements. I think these must not, they must not be disengaged because, like I said, the state institutions that have been heavily impacted, they need, let's say, these engagements to continue so as to even bring back a sense of normalcy. So I think India's role going forward has to be towards a democratic, let's say, the democratic Nepal with, of course, political alignments have changed, but I mean, that's where the new engagements must start.
So, Amish, then let me close by asking you just what we could expect to see moving forward over the next couple of weeks. What exactly should we be looking out for in terms of the formation of the new government, in terms of some of the reforms that they bring in? What happens to leaders like KP Sharma Oli and Sher Bahadur Doeba and all the established political elites? What exactly should we be looking out for? How does this progress over the next couple of weeks?
Okay. So in terms of the old political leadership, like I said, I think their credibility is completely gone. I don't think it will be regained, and I think it is high time for them to make way for the second and the third generation of leadership within their parties, who actually have to start rebuilding the trust, the political trust between the parties and the people once again. And this requires new vision. This requires new leadership that these existing leaders cannot provide. That's one, right? In terms of reforms, I think there will be a heavy focus on corruption. There will be one of the key demands the protesters have made is investigations into corruption cases of the past, into corruption, let's say, like charges of the past, and I think that will certainly be one of the major agendas of any interim government formation going ahead. Uh, in terms of, let's say, the other thing that we should be watching out for is when the next elections will happen, because, like I said, the Gen Zs have declared that this current parliament does not represent their mandate. I think they want a new mandate, and depending on how long or how far away the elections are, right? What are the parties? Whether the Gen Zs form any parties, whether any sort of, let's say, political representation becomes formalized as a political party. I think these are some of the things that we should be looking forward. And then eventually will come the task of rebuilding the state's institutions. Because, like I said, almost every pillar of democracy, almost every pillar of the state has been, let's say, hollowed out. And not just, let's say, physically, but this protest, the speed at which such institutions fell, also showed how politicized these institutions had become. And I think there is a deep, let's say, sense among not just the Gen Z, but among the general population that all these institutions, the state's institutions, can no longer be led by political appointees. I think we'll have to see how these reforms happen going forward.
Understood. Amish Raj Mulmi sitting in Kathmandu, talking to us about the current state of the Gen Z protests in Nepal, the formation of a new interim government, the prospects for reform, and of course, what India's policy should be moving forward on this important question in the neighborhood. Amish, thank you so much for joining us. And again, thank you to our viewers for joining us here on HT Podcast.